It's a Friday evening in Montana. The sun is going down behind the mountains. The air smells like pine trees and fresh concrete. 150 guests in tuxedos and evening gowns are sipping champagne inside the most expensive building ever built on that ridge. The governor of Montana is standing at the front entrance, holding a pair of oversized golden scissors. Camera flashes are going off everywhere. Behind him, smiling like a man who just conquered the world, is Henry Vance, a real estate developer who spent $50 million turning a Montana mountain into what he called the crown jewel of American luxury. The Emerald Peaks Resort. 5 stories. Italian marble floors. A rooftop infinity pool. A 3-story glass waterfall in the grand ballroom. Private helicopter pads. The kind of place where a single weekend could cost more than most people's monthly rent. Henry had waited 3 years for this moment. The governor raises the scissors. The crowd starts counting down. 3, 2, 1. The ribbon drops. And then, something goes wrong. It starts small. A low rhythmic thumping sound. Coming from underneath the floor. Almost like a heartbeat, but way too fast. Too desperate. A few guests look down at their feet, confused. Then someone screams. A crack is moving across the Italian marble floor. Starting from the center of the grand ballroom and racing toward the walls, fast. Like a zipper being ripped open on a suitcase. Then the waterfall, the 3-story glass centerpiece that took 8 months to build, stops flowing. And then it does something no one expected. It starts pulling air in. A high-pitched mechanical shriek fills the room. Like metal tearing apart deep underground. Then the smell hits. Rotten eggs. Sulfur. Black dust starts coughing out of the air vents, coating the white tablecloths, the champagne glasses, the silk dresses. The governor's smile disappears. The investors, the men and women who put millions of dollars into this project, look at the cracking walls. Then they look at Henry. In less than 60 seconds, $50 million of prestige starts to fall apart. Henry pushes through the crowd. He gets to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looks out at the mountain. His face goes pale. 2 miles away, on a ridge he thought was empty, a single campfire is burning in the darkness. And standing next to that fire is a 65-year-old man in a faded marine jacket. Watching. Waiting. Patient as the mountain itself. This is the story of David Calloway. A retired marine engineer. A widower. A man who spent 30 years serving his country, and then spent 3 months quietly destroying the man who took everything from him. Not with violence. Not with lawyers. With water. And physics. And a document written in 1902.to understand what David did. You first have to understand what he lost. David Calloway grew up on a mountain ridge in western Montana. His father was a timber man. His grandfather before that. The family had owned those 80 acres for 3 generations. When David joined the Marine Corps at 18, his father told him, "That land will be here when you get back. Mountains don't go anywhere." He was right. For 30 years the mountain waited. David served as a marine engineer, the kind of marine who doesn't just fight. He builds bridges over rivers in Iraq, roads through jungles in the Philippines, water systems in rural villages in Afghanistan. His job was to look at a piece of land and understand its structure, its pressure points, its limits. He understood physics the way most people understand breathing. Automatically. Deeply. Without having to think about it. When he retired at 58, David came back to Montana with one goal. Peace and quiet. His father had passed while he was overseas. Left him the 80 acres, the cabin, and a handwritten note that said, "Take care of what the mountain gave us." David took that seriously. He spent his mornings chopping firewood in the cool mountain air. Clean rhythmic strokes. Like a metronome. His afternoons were spent in the garden behind the cabin. Now, this wasn't just any garden. This was Sarah's garden. Sarah was David's wife. She had passed from cancer 2 years before David retired. While he was in the middle of a deployment, she spent her last healthy years building something beautiful on that ridge. She planted rare mountain lilies. Wild poppies in deep red and orange. Lavender that hummed with bees all summer. She kept a handwritten journal of every plant, where she got it, how to care for it, what it looked like in different seasons. When David came home and saw the garden for the first time after she was gone, he sat down on the wooden bench she had built and didn't move for 3 hours. That garden wasn't dirt. It was the last conversation he had with his wife. Every morning he'd sit on that bench with his coffee, just listening. The mountain wind, the birds, the sound of water moving somewhere under the earth. He was happy. Quietly, deeply happy. Then Henry Vance showed up. Henry Vance did not knock on doors. He arrived. His black SUV pulled into David's gravel driveway on a Tuesday morning. 2 men in suits stood by the car while Henry walked up to the porch. He was wearing a silk tie on a mountain in Montana, which should have told David everything he needed to know. Henry was charming. Smooth. The kind of man who had learned how to make people feel like they were making a smart decision, when really Henry was making the smart decision for himself. He explained that he had purchased the surrounding land, that he was building a luxury resort, that David's 80 acres sat right in the middle of what could be a transformational development for the entire state. Then he slid a check across the porch railing. 3 times the market value. David picked it up, looked at it, set it back down on the railing. Not for sale, he said. Henry didn't flinch. He smiled the way a man smiles when he's already thought 10 moves ahead. David, he said looking at the mountain, progress is like gravity. You can try to fight it, but you'll just end up tired. He picked up the check, put it back in his jacket pocket and drove away. 2 weeks later the sheriff arrived. Not with another offer. With a court order. Henry's legal team had been busy. They had found a loophole in Montana's eminent domain statutes, the law that allows the government to take private property for public use. It's a law meant for highways and power lines. Henry's lawyers convinced the county that David's land was essential for a public utility corridor that would serve the broader region. It was creative, it was aggressive, and it was technically legal. But the genius of it, the truly vicious part, was what they chose to take. They didn't take all 80 acres. They took the center of the property, the access roads, the main trail, the area that connected David's cabin to the outside world. They landlocked him, cut him off, made it legally and practically impossible for David to use his own property. And they gave the resort full control over every road in and out. David hired a lawyer. The lawyer told him the truth. Fighting eminent domain in court was expensive, slow, and rarely successful, especially when a county had already approved the taking. David was 65 years old, living on a Marine retirement pension. He didn't have the money for a years-long legal battle. 3 weeks after the court order, the bulldozers arrived. David stood on his porch and watched. He watched a front loader the size of a small house roll across his land. He watched it push through the fence at the edge of the property. He watched it cross the yard. And then he watched it drive directly into Sarah's garden. The rare lilies, the wild poppies, the lavender, the wooden bench, all of it, gone. In about 45 seconds. The journal she had kept was in the cabin. But the plants she had touched with her own hands, planted and tended and loved, they were just gone. Crushed flat under yellow steel treads. Henry walked up while the loader was still working. He was adjusting his tie, looking at the mountain. "It's just dirt, David," he said. "Don't be a martyr for a garden. Move to the city. Let the big boys build something that actually matters." David didn't yell. He didn't reach for anything. He just watched the hydraulic fluid dripping from the loader's arm, leaving a dark stain in the torn-up earth. "The earth has a memory, Henry," he said quietly. "I hope you're ready for it." Henry didn't respond. He walked back to his SUV and drove up the ridge. The county relocated David to an apartment in the city as part of the settlement. It was a clean, modern place. 47th floor. Big windows. The kind of apartment that looked impressive in photos and felt like a holding cell in real life. The traffic noise never stopped. The lights never went fully dark. There were no birds. No wind in the pines. No sound of water moving underground. For 3 days David barely moved. He sat in a chair by the window. Stared at the city. His Marine Corps shadow box, his medals, his rank insignia, a photo of him and Sarah, sat on a plastic folding table in the corner, still wrapped in brown paper from the move. He almost quit. The settlement Henry's lawyers had sent over was sitting on the kitchen counter. If he signed it, he'd get a final cash payment and give up all future claims to the property. Henry would own every inch of it forever. Clean and simple. For 3 days David looked at that envelope. On the 4th morning he woke up early. Did something out of habit. He went to make coffee, and noticed a mason jar on the windowsill. Before the bulldozers came, He had taken a scoop of soil from the edge of Sarah's garden and sealed it in that jar. He opened it. The smell of mountain soil, pine roots, and something alive, rich and deep, filled that sterile apartment. He stood there for a long time. Then he put on his jacket, picked up his car keys, and drove to the county records office. What David did next wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It looked, from the outside, like a retired man doing boring research in a government building. But what he was actually doing was building a bomb. A very slow, very legal, very devastating bomb. He spent 12 hours a day in the county archives. Day after day. He wasn't looking for anything specific at first. He was doing what any good engineer does before they start a project. Learning the ground. He pulled geological surveys. Topographical maps. Old homestead records dating back to the 1800s. Environmental impact studies, including the ones Henry's development team had filed, and the ones they had quietly skipped over. He requested the original water diversion permits Henry had used to redirect the natural spring that ran through the ridge. He read everything. And slowly a picture started to form. Henry had built his resort on a ridge made primarily of shale. Shale is a sedimentary rock. It looks solid. It feels solid. But it has a property that makes engineers very nervous. When it gets wet, it becomes slippery. Dangerously slippery. Shale has almost no friction when it's saturated. Henry's engineers knew about this. Their solution was to divert the natural spring that had flowed through the ridge for over 100 years. Pipe the water away. Keep the ground dry. Problem solved. And it worked as long as the water stayed diverted. But David found something Henry's team had missed. Or maybe something they had chosen to ignore because looking too closely would have slowed down construction. Under the ridge, beneath the shale layer, was what geologists call a lenticular aquifer. Think of it like a lens-shaped pocket of water trapped between two layers of rock. It had been there for thousands of years. Fed by the same spring Henry had diverted. Stable for as long as the water above it was flowing naturally. When Henry's engineers piped the spring away, they changed the pressure in the system. The aquifer was no longer being fed from above. It began to slowly compress. The weight of the building, 5 stories of concrete, steel, marble, and glass, was sitting on top of ground that was, in essence, a very slow-moving water balloon. David had seen this kind of failure before. Not with resorts. With bridges, with roads, with military installations built in a hurry by people who didn't have time to read the geology properly. He knew exactly what would happen when that aquifer reached its pressure limit. The shale would liquefy. The foundation would shift. And a $50 million building would start to slide in slow motion, right off the side of a mountain. But that discovery wasn't even the most important thing he found. The most important thing was a document from 1902. Buried in a folder of old homestead records was a Homestead Water Act filing, made by David's great-grandfather when the family first settled that land. The document established in legally binding terms the family's water rights to the spring head, the source of the spring that fed the ridge. Now here's where Henry's legal team made their critical mistake. When they used eminent domain to take David's land for the utility corridor, they were very specific about what they were taking. They took surface rights, road access, building rights. What they did not take, because they didn't know it existed, were the mineral and water rights to the springhead itself. And that springhead sat on a small rock formation that was still legally part of David's property. David sat back in his chair in the county archives, surrounded by 100-year-old documents. He looked at the water rights certificate, at the geological survey, at the aquifer map he had sketched on a piece of graph paper. He had everything he needed. He wasn't going to blow anything up. He wasn't going to trespass. He wasn't going to break a single law. He was simply going to give the mountain a drink of water. And let physics do the rest. David drove back to Montana. Not to his apartment. To the mountain. He set up a small camp 2 miles upstream from the resort site, in a section of land that was completely within his legal water rights. He built a fire. He ate simple food. He slept under the stars. He felt better than he had in months. During the days he worked, a dry creek bed ran through the area, a channel that had once carried water from the spring before Henry's engineers had redirected it. Over the years, it had filled with rocks, debris, fallen branches, and sediment. Naturally blocked. David began clearing it. Methodically. Carefully. Not with heavy machinery, just a shovel, a pry bar, and 30 years of engineering experience. He moved the right rocks in the right order, the way you'd dismantle a dam without creating a flood. He was performing what legally qualified as environmental restoration. Under his 1902 water rights, he had the right to maintain and restore the natural waterways on his property. He wasn't diverting anything. He was undiverting it, returning the water to its original path. Slowly, very slowly, the pressure in the underground system began to shift. Deep below the resort, the lenticular aquifer began to fill. Back at the resort, construction was in its final weeks. Henry was everywhere. Driven by deadline, driven by debt. His financing structure required a grand opening by a specific date. If he missed it, his investors had the right to pull out and the banks would call in their loans. He was running on 4 hours of sleep and pure adrenaline. His foremen were pushing workers through double shifts. Corners were being cut. Inspections were being rushed. The building looked beautiful, all polished marble and gleaming glass, but underneath the surface things were being patched and painted over rather than properly fixed. One foreman pulled Henry aside during a walkthrough. He pointed to the basement floor. A hairline crack had appeared in the concrete slab, running about 8 feet across the utility room. "This needs to be looked at," the foreman said. Henry crouched down, ran his finger along the crack, stood back up. "Patch it," he said. "Buildings settle. That's normal." The foreman hesitated. "I'd feel better if we got an engineer in here too." "We open in 3 weeks," Henry said. "Patch it. Keep moving." The foreman patched it. A week later there were 3 more cracks in the same room. Meanwhile, David made careful progress upstream. He wasn't in a hurry. He was an engineer. He understood that patience was a structural advantage. Rushing created mistakes. Slow and correct created results. Every evening he'd sit by his campfire and check his calculations. He had a simple pressure model he'd sketched out in a notebook, based on the aquifer volume, the soil permeability of the shale, and the weight load of the building. He estimated the critical point, the moment when the aquifer would be full enough and the shale wet enough to begin shifting, would arrive somewhere around the date of the grand opening. He hadn't planned it that way. The mountain had. Then came the moment when things almost went wrong. Henry's lead architect, a sharp man named Marcus Chin, had been quietly worried for weeks. He was the one professional on the project who had actually read the geological surveys. Not all of them, but enough. On a Tuesday afternoon, Marcus took a walk along the upstream ridge. He wasn't looking for anything. He just needed air away from Henry's constant pressure. He found the restored creek bed. He saw the fresh shovel marks, the repositioned rocks, the clear, cold water now running in a channel that had been dry for 3 years. Marcus was a good architect. He understood what he was looking at. He drove straight back to Henry's construction trailer and laid out what he'd found. He told Henry exactly what was happening: the aquifer, the shale, the water rights, the risk. Henry went pale. For about 30 seconds he didn't speak. Then he asked one question: "What happens if we delay the opening?" Marcus told him. The investors would have grounds to pull out. The banks would accelerate the loans. Henry would lose everything: the resort, his development company, his personal assets. He built this project on leverage, and the leverage only worked if the opening happened on schedule. Henry sat in the silence of that trailer for a long time. "Find the old man's camp," he finally said. "Send 2 guys. Make him uncomfortable." Marcus looked at him. "I'm talking about a structural failure, Henry. People could get hurt." "Send 2 guys." 2 men in black jackets showed up at David's camp the following afternoon. They were private security, ex-military by the look of them. They parked a truck on the access road and walked up to David's fire. They didn't say much. They just stood there, watching. David was sitting in his lawn chair, reading. He looked up at them, looked back down at his book. After a long moment, he held up the document he was reading. The 1902 Homestead Water Act. Laminated. "You tell Henry," David said without looking up, "that the mountain is thirsty. And I'm just giving it a drink." The 2 men looked at each other. They had been hired to intimidate a retired old man. They had found someone who was not interested in being intimidated. They walked back to their truck and drove away. Henry got the message. He made one more calculation. If he called the authorities, David would produce the water rights document. The county would investigate. Construction would be halted. He'd lose everything anyway, but slower and more publicly. If he went to court, the case would take months. The opening would pass. Same result. His only move was to proceed and hope the building held long enough to get through the opening weekend. Henry chose to proceed. Friday arrived. Henry had spared no expense on the ceremony. A string quartet played in the lobby. The champagne was imported from France. A red carpet ran from the valet stand to the front doors. The governor arrived at 6:30. Investors flew in from Denver, Dallas, and New York. Local media set up cameras along the red carpet. Henry shook hands, smiled for photos, whispered to his marketing director about which angles made the building look best. He was performing confidence so hard that, for a few minutes, even he believed it. At 7 o'clock, the governor picked up the golden scissors. At 7:02 the ribbon fell. At 7:03 the thumping began. It came from directly below the grand ballroom. A rhythmic, low vibration. Not mechanical. Something deeper. Something geological. The first crack appeared at 7:04. Racing across the Italian marble floor from the center of the room to the far wall. Clean and fast, like someone had drawn a line with a ruler. The 3-story glass waterfall, fed by a pump system connected to the basement, began pulling air instead of pushing water. The suction created a screaming mechanical whine that cut right through the string quartet's music. The smell came next. Underground water forcing its way through compacted sulfur-rich shale releases a specific odor. Rotten eggs. Unmistakable. It came through every vent in the building simultaneously. Then the lights flickered. The infinity pool on the roof, 50,000 gallons of heated, chemically treated water, had been sitting on top of the weakest point in the structure. As the foundation shifted, the pool cracked along its seam. The water dropped through the crack, hit the electrical grid on the 4th floor, and took out the power to the entire building. In the sudden darkness you could hear the mountain. A deep, subsonic groan. The sound of 10,000 tons of saturated shale beginning very slowly to move. People were running. Champagne glasses hit marble. Someone was screaming for the exits. The governor was being pulled toward a fire door by his security detail. Henry stood completely still in the middle of the lobby. He watched his $50 million vision come apart in real time. And somewhere 2 miles away in the dark, a campfire was burning. By Saturday morning, the building had been condemned. Structural engineers brought in by the county confirmed what David already knew. The foundation had shifted 14 inches. The shale beneath the building was fully saturated. Without major intervention, the structure would continue to move, possibly for months. The insurance company was on site before noon. The investors had their lawyers on the phone before breakfast. Henry's financial structure, built on the assumption that the grand opening would happen and the loans would begin to be repaid, collapsed completely. Within 72 hours he had received formal notice of lawsuits from 4 investors, 2 contractors and the county itself. He was sitting on the ruined front steps of his condemned lobby on Saturday afternoon. His silk tie was loosened. His jacket was on the steps beside him. He hadn't slept. A truck came up the access road. David's truck. It parked. David got out. He walked up the steps and sat down next to Henry without saying anything for a moment, just looking at the mountain. Then he handed Henry a folder. Henry opened it slowly. Inside was a legal document. But not a lawsuit. Not a criminal complaint. A settlement offer. David had drafted it with a county-certified engineer. The terms were simple. David would use his engineering expertise to design a proper stabilization plan for the aquifer. A real one, not a patch job. A plan that would rechannel the spring correctly, relieve the pressure on the shale, and return the underground water system to a stable state. This would stop the foundation from shifting further. It would make the building salvageable for a smaller, lighter project. Maybe a boutique lodge. Not a 5-star resort, but something. In exchange, David got 2 things. First, all 80 acres of his original land returned to him in full. Second, Henry was legally required to fund the complete restoration of Sarah's garden. Every plant as close as possible to the original. Supervised by David. Paid for by Henry. Henry read it twice. Then he looked at David. Why? He asked. His voice was quiet. Almost broken. You could have just let the whole thing slide into the valley. You could have destroyed me completely. David looked out at the ridge. The morning sun was hitting the pines, turning them gold. Because Henry, he said, I don't build things to see them break. I build them to last. He paused. You built a lie on top of a mountain that had a memory. I didn't destroy you. I just gave the truth a path back to the surface. Henry looked at the document for a long time. Then he picked up the pen. The legal process took 8 months. Henry's development company was dissolved. He settled with his investors in the county. He lost the resort, his portfolio, and most of his personal wealth. He moved to Phoenix, where, last anyone heard, he was consulting on small residential projects. David went back to the mountain. The stabilization project took 6 months of careful, methodical work. David supervised every step himself. The spring was rechanneled along a path that balanced the aquifer without flooding the shale. The pressure stabilized. The building stopped moving. A smaller development group eventually bought the structure, stripped it down to its bones, and rebuilt it as a modest 30-room lodge. No infinity pools. No 5-story waterfalls. Just simple rooms and a clear view of the ridge. They hired a local hydrologist to maintain the water systems. The garden took longer. David spent an entire spring season in Sarah's journal, reading every entry, tracking down every plant she had cataloged. Some were rare enough that he had to contact botanical gardens in 3 different states. One of the lilies she had grown took 14 months to source. But he found them all. On a warm morning in late June, David planted the last flower, a deep red alpine poppy, exactly like the one Sarah had first planted 22 years ago. He sat down on the new wooden bench he had built in the same spot as the old one. He had his coffee. He listened to the wind. He heard the birds come back. He heard the water moving somewhere beneath the earth, steady now, moving in its right channel, the way it was always meant to. He sat there for a long time. If you ever drive through that part of western Montana, you won't find a 5-star resort on that ridge. You'll find a quiet mountain. Some pines. A small lodge with a handmade sign out front. And if you go up one of the back trails, the ones that aren't on any map, you might find a cabin. Simple. Weathered. A garden out back that smells like something you can't quite name but makes you feel like you should slow down. And if it's morning, you might see an old man in a faded marine jacket sitting on a wooden bench. Not reading. Not doing anything. Just listening. The mountain is quiet now. David finally has the silence he earned. Henry Vance learned the hard way that you can buy a man's land, and you can use the law to take his roads. But you should never try to own the water that keeps him alive. If this story hit you, drop a comment below. And if you want more stories about everyday people who outthink the powerful, subscribe. New story every day.